Welcome to the channel, everyone. If you've not been to my channel before, then I normally do gameplay videos, but today I thought I'd do something a bit different and maybe just have kind of like an informal chat with you all about just the state of the game 2023, just to see how you're all getting on. So yeah, you can see here on my decks here, so I've got 97 out of 100 built, so you could say I've had some experience playing the game, played the game for must be about 12 years now. Made countless decks. It says 97 out of 100, but I do delete them over time just because I just need the space to make more decks. Yeah, let's get into a few things about the game. One of my viewers a while back asked me about ratios and percentages. So let's just take a look at one of my decks that I've been using quite a lot lately, and I really am enjoying. It's Heliod, the Radiant Dawn from the latest set. So we won't be doing any gameplay for this, but you can see gameplay for this video a few videos ago, so go and check that out. What I can do is, if people want to, I can leave this deck list up if you'd like to do that, and you'll see why at the end, because we're going to talk about how many of certain cards you want to put in the deck, how decks are made, and what threats you might expect in 2023. So before I get into the Heliod deck tech itself and just how decks could be made in 2023, let's look at the main threats that we're facing in 2023. In standard queue, we won't really talk about Hell queue too much because you probably already know that. Hell queue is the highest tier you can get, and that's where the most horrendous cards await you in the competitive nature of the game, even though it's casual. So let's talk about Atraxa Grand Unifier. So this card, I think, should be in Hell queue, but you will see this in lower queues, which is kind of crazy. But let's talk about the card. It's a 7 mana 7/7 with 4 abilities, very powerful. That stuff by itself might not be too bad, but the fact it comes in and it gives the player up to 10 cards, essentially. Roll the top 10 cards, and for each card type, put one of those cards into your hand. So it's already ludicrous, okay? So how do we combat this threat, because she's so numerous? Okay, so let's go to the cards that I think would be good. Combat Atraxa is, oddly enough, Elish Norn, which is weirdly like her mummy. But the second big paragraph is what we care about here. Permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponent controls to trigger. So Elish Norn is a really good hit here. Okay, so I've just had to set the command as a 5-color card just so we can see the cards in this search bar up here. So don't mind the Golos here. This is nothing to do with the actual content, but Hushbringer is also another way you can stop Atraxa. Creatures entering the battlefield or dying don't cause abilities to trigger. So this is good against Atraxa and also good against any sacrifice style decks. You also have Tocatli Honor Guard, which stops the abilities happening altogether. Just be wary that with these two cards, your opponent's Titans will just come in unimpeded. So the Titans are the cards Croxer, which normally comes in and sacrifices itself, and Uro. Now, the reason you have to be careful is, obviously, if your opponent's using these as the commanders, you probably don't want to go for those aforementioned cards because they'll just come in, don't sacrifice, and then they'll be able to attack you every turn. So that's one way to deal with the Atraxa, to stop the ETBs, okay? So that's one of the threats you might encounter. Annoyingly, another threat you might encounter is this Atraxa, Praetor's Voice. People are using this card in droves. Now, the good part is she's nowhere near as strong as this Atraxa. She's quite a bit weaker, but the issue with this Atraxa is just the nature of proliferation, how you don't have to interact with your opponent in order for them to get counters. So if they've poisoned you or they're getting Planeswalkers, it's going to be really tough to get out of those situations sometimes, because sometimes you just can't pressure the Planeswalkers, you can't get rid of an effect. But if you've got something like Melira can prevent the number of poison counters put on you this turn, because it says if you would get one or more poison counters, instead you get one and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. So essentially she can stop you getting more than one a turn, which is going to be pretty useful. By the way, if you search and put not collected, you'll see every card that has these kind of abilities on them. You've also got weird things like Solemnity, which says players can't get counters. This also stops you from getting poison counters, something that might not be very useful in most games, but if you just have a free slot, there's no reason why you can't use this. There's probably a lot of interesting things you can do with Solemnity. In fact, in Modern, there's a few cards that takes advantage of this. Now, sadly, this can't stop Planeswalkers. They can still tick up. But yeah, Solemnity's a pretty interesting way to stop you getting infect. So When it comes to planeswalkers, which are very threatening, the best thing I can think of, if you're absolutely sick of seeing loads of planeswalkers, is Elder Spell. So Elder Spell can kill any number of planeswalkers, and then you choose a planeswalker you control, put 2 loyalty on it for each planeswalker destroyed this way. So that's one way you can get around a Traxxas Planeswalkers build, which is kind of crazy to think about how many Planeswalkers they could chuck out at one turn. There's only one card that does it so far, but it's pretty damn good. Another card we're seeing a lot in the meta lately, I find, is this new Atali, Primal Conqueror. It comes in, it gets 2 spells from your opponent. Sorry, it gets a spell from your deck and a spell from your opponent's deck. So it's 2 free spells, and then it can flip into Atali Primal Sickness. But to be honest, I've not really been killed by the flip side too much. There is one interesting sideboard technique you can use against this Atali, however. So there's quite a few of these cards. We've got stuff like Deafening Silence. Each player can't cast more than 1 non-creature spell each turn. That would stop Atali because they can't play 2 spells a turn of the non-creature. You've got Archon of Emeria, which says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. So that's any spell, not just non-creature. You also have Phyrexian Censor, which is brand new, which says you can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian spell each turn. And you also have Rule of Law, which says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn as well. So there's a plethora of ways to deal with that Atali flipping over. So if you are playing the regular queues, I'd say those are the top ones you keep seeing. I guess another one you would see is, which probably should be in held queue, is Ragavan. Now the answer to Ragavan is pretty simple. You want to get them a lot of 1 mana to 2 mana removal as much as possible, because in order to deal with this guy, you need to just kill him outright really fast. So the best spells in the colours, I'd say stuff like Fatal Push in black, which is really good. In white, we've got Swords to Plowshares. In blue, we've got Fading Hope, which is temporary, but it does slow them down. In green, you're going to struggle a bit because there's nothing that can just kill stuff outright. You need to fight, but there's loads of green spells for 1 mana that fights. And then for red, you probably know it by now, but we've got Lightning Bolt, which is 1 red, deals 3 damage. So these are what I'd recommend to kill Ragavan. So this video is essentially going to be just as much help as I can give you to try and do your best in the 2023 historic Brawl environment. If you're playing in held queue, then you probably deserve the opponent you're facing. But similarly, with cards like Rusko here, who comes in with an ETB, and also Golos, who has an ETB. The same thing applies for a Traxxas. Anything you can do to stop them ETBing is fantastic. Anything you can stop them from casting multiple spells per turn is fantastic. Are you noticing a theme here, by the way, in these broken top tier cards? They all gain loads of advantage. They draw loads of cards, play loads of spells per turn. It's just incredibly common. And yeah. Also, another thing is, if you find that your opponent continuously is tutoring and you're fed up, absolutely fed up, let me introduce you to Ashiok and their passive. A lot of people forget this, but this Ashiok, very underrated. Firstly, he's great against sacrifice decks, great against graveyard decks, but the top passive, spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause the controller to search their library. So this is fantastic. This works against even the simplest cards, stuff that you wouldn't even think, like Evolving Wilds, which is a common fetch land. If your opponent tries to do this with the Ashiok out, nothing will happen. And it's just absolutely wild. Absolutely fantastic card against those. If you're having problems against graveyard decks, which there are many, many, many of, Colourless is actually your best friend here, which is fantastic because it's available to all colours. Tormod's Crypt is probably a classic example used in Modern, I think probably Legacy as well. You've got Relic of Progenitus, which can even draw your card in case you want to gain the advantage back. There's so many cards like this now. Scrabbling Claws, Sentinel Totem, all deal with opponents' graveyards. Soul Guide Lantern's one of my faves because it comes in and it does something immediately. Might not be fast enough, but you can also draw a card later on as well. Very useful in the Historic Brawl format. And I think that's probably the best primer I can give you against threats that you may see in 2023. Okay, so just rewind the video and watch this segment if you're having any problems dealing with those threats. Okay, so now we're back into the Heliodetect Tech example. Okay, so don't take this for gospel. It's just my opinion at the end of the day. Everyone has their own deck building strategies. I'm not saying I'm an absolute master. I'm learning things every day, but I have played the game for long enough now to know what's what, and I can safely say I'm pretty confident teaching people And so let's look at the statistics of the deck itself. So I've got 14 creatures. So the creatures, if we're talking about statistics here, don't worry too much about creatures because this always depends on what your actual game plan is. For instance, if you're playing a control deck, you might not even need any creatures whatsoever. You could have planeswalkers, you could have enchantments as a win con. It's not impossible to build in any way, shape or form. There is literally a trillion ways to build a deck. There's, what is it, 25,000 cards or more in the, not in the format, but in the game. Or probably more than that now, probably 30,000. But you get the point. There's so many ways to build. So don't let anyone tell you what you can and cannot do. This is just a guide in case you feel a bit lost. We've got 13 instants, 7 sorceries. Again, this is just rough. This doesn't really mean anything yet. We'll get into that in a moment. Artifacts 11, enchantments 13, planeswalkers 3, lands 40. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that you don't necessarily need to let your OCD overwhelm you. When I first started building, I used to, well, I still am to some extent. I like rounded numbers. I like the number 10. I like things to add up and equate and fit perfectly, right? The only number I would say to focus on in 1v1 Historic Brawl is the land count, because I used to run about 36 and a few rocks, but I'm finding that the game just isn't very generous in terms of land smoothing. The lands they give you, even with 40 lands and quite a few rocks, the game still just wants to give you 2 lands. So just try to have at least 40, I beg you. It will change how you play. You'll get better hands, and it just works out perfectly. It's the same amount as if you have 26 lands in a 60 card deck, roughly. So just bear that in mind. When I used to play 60 card standard, 26 lands was good for a control deck. If you miss a land drop, you will probably lose the game. It's as simple as that. Lands are the least glamorous type in the game, but they are the most important because you can't play any spells without them. But I think people neglect that fact. So let's look at the land count. 40, make sure it's lands that you find useful. I would say the one thing, unless you're playing monocolor, is remember the command tower. This is the best land in your entire deck. Try to have as many duels as possible. So in this instance, I've got 13 dual lands. I would say try and have about 10 or so, just because you want to have the consistency of hitting the double colors. So if you look at spells in your deck, let's look at Hour of Revelation. If your spell has triple pips, you are basically saying you need to hit this certain amount of lands by turn 6. But the odds of you actually doing that are actually quite low. But you can increase that chance by just having more dual lands. And now notice a lot of these don't come in tapped, but just because the format is quite young, we don't have all the perfect lands in here yet. So it's getting there. It's really good so far. But yeah, by the way, I'm not a mathematician whatsoever. I'm sure some of you out there are wonderful mathematicians and you know the answers and can work out all the maths. But this is just essentially from feel. You know, I've done this from feel, what feels right. You want to have, I'd say about 10 of each basic type if you're using dual color, just because you want to have the consistency of untapped lands. You don't want to overcrowd your mana base. If you're starting out and you don't have many wild cards, you don't even have to craft that many dual lands, to be honest. It's not necessary. It just smooths the games out, and it just gets better over time, and it's a worthy investment to unlock these. I mean, if you look at Port Town, this cycle used to be rare, so now it's uncommon. So that's nice of Wizards for once to give you a downgrade, which is good. So now we can look into the nitty-gritty of removal spells. So this is the meat of the video. This is kind of like why I wanted to make the video, for somebody who asked me, how many removal spells do I use in my decks? Now, one-on-one, I think the answer is going to be a lot higher. It should be probably a lot higher than in paper. So a cool search field I found recently, literally today, was I was putting in the words destroy and exile in here. But obviously, this is only going to search cards which have the word both words on, which is incredibly unlikely. What I realised was, let's try the all clause, and now it brings up every spell in your deck which either destroys or exiles something, which is pretty useful. It's not massively accurate because it includes stuff that flickers, like Essence Flux, but this is a good way to see what's actually in your deck. Now, if you just look at the visualizer here, looks to be around half, doesn't it? But you just got to remember that this doesn't include everything that just kills or exiles. You have to just be a bit savvy about it. What I would say is a good number of removal to start with in Historic Brawl is about 10. You should definitely aim for about 10 because that's 1/10 of your entire deck, and it just means you're going to get consistency, right? 10 is a good number, But you don't have to be perfect at 10. As I was saying before, you can flex that number. You can flex that number and increase other things. Depends on how your deck works. Heliod is an interesting colour pair because normally white-blue wants to be very countery, very stopping people from playing Magic. But that isn't how I like to play. I like people to resolve most of their spells. I mean, if you look at my spells here, I don't even want to counter spell. Just trying to prove you don't need counter spells. In fact, there's not a single counterspell in the deck apart from Dovin's Veto, which is just a one-off. And that's fantastic to me. So you want to keep your removal quite low curve, single target stuff, because threats are so efficient these days. So you want to have a few one-drop removal spells like Swords, Fragment Reality, because you want to deal with stuff like, as I was saying, remember before, Ragavan, because if you can't deal with Ragavan turn 1, you probably will lose the game. That's the scary thing about just stuff like Ragavan these days. The 2-drops, we've got quite a lot of things that can remove as well. You've got the Argivian Welcome, destroys a creature power 4 greater. This can exile something. This exiles an artifact or enchantment, which is very useful. Do not forget to have ways in your deck that can get rid of artifacts or enchantments. I understand this is a bit of a blanket statement because not all colours are even in terms of the removal, and this is a very niche example here, having white-blue, but I just want you to kind of get the gist of what makes a deck tick, what makes a deck efficient, you know. So in terms of removal, how do you decide between what destroys and what exiles? Well, again, it's down to just the style of the deck. It's actually very difficult to advise. You could have a deck, for instance, that cares about reanimation. So you can think of a deck like Shieldred, where Shieldred wants to reanimate stuff from your graveyard or even your opponent's graveyard with the new Shieldred. But if your deck has a lot of exile effects, then suddenly reanimating doesn't sound so good because you've got nothing to reanimate because you exiled it, right? So just be cautious. Luckily, in a deck like this, we don't have to worry too much. But there is a reason I didn't put Farewell in the deck. So Farewell says exile any number of things. You can say exile all creatures, artifacts, or enchantments. But if you look at Heliod, Heliod says return a card, enchantment card from your graveyard that isn't a card to your hand. Now, if we had Farewell in the deck and we exile all enchantments, let's say, how would we return something like the Phasing of Zhalfir to our hand? It would be exiled and never to be returned again. So you have to think that there's so many plates you have to spin when making a deck. That's why it takes so long to become even competent at it. I think that's probably why so many people net deck, which is something I don't do. I like to create my own decks. But yeah, it's important to formulate these patterns and strategies because you can apply them across deck building across any number of decks. So, as I was saying before, when you're putting in removal, make sure it's the correct type. So we've got 2 ways in the deck to destroy non-land permanents, but just destroy. And these are important as well because in 1v1, the board can get so gummed up. So if you're using any colour deck, try to include cards that can get rid of all things. If you're using a creature token strategy, don't just think that you're going to be up. So if you have a deck that, let's say, makes 100 creature tokens, don't say to yourself, don't include a board wipe, because that's magical Christmas land. You'll not always be in a situation where you can control your opponent's 100 creatures, for instance, and something like a board wipe is the only way of getting rid of troublesome creatures en masse. If your opponent has 2 creatures out, which would you rather have? A Swords to Plowshares or a Day of Judgment? Even if you're getting a 2 for 1, the Day of Judgment is infinitely more efficient than the Swords, because the Swords is 1 card that gets rid of 1 thing. Very tactical, precision weapon, but sometimes a Day of Judgment just has to be used because there's no other solution. You will just straight up die. And I know I have a friend who doesn't like board wipes, but over the years, maybe I can slowly convince him. But yeah, board wipes are just useful. And then you have stuff like Time Wipe, which staples another ability on top of the board wipe. So this is basically an unsummon effect. Returns a creature you control to its owner's hand to destroy all other creatures, which is really fantastic because if you have a commander with an enters the battlefield ability like Heliod, you can then redeploy him to the field and use him again, which is really useful because something like this normally just wipes out all creatures. As you can see, the curve I'm using has a curve of 1 to 6. So you want to have removal across all the costs because you never know what you're going to need. Having a removal package is like taking a picnic basket on a picnic. You want to have everything with you, all the snacks you want, all the drinks you want, because you never know how you're going to feel when you get there. So it's just important. And make sure you can deal with different things. Borrowed Time can deal with non-land permanents. The Obscure Polymorphist can deal with creatures only. But you'll find that when things can only deal with one thing only, they're very good at that thing that they do, right? You don't always need to have the Borrowed Time, but it's useful because it hits everything. But it's 3 mana, right? A spell like this couldn't be 2 mana. I don't think there is such a spell for 2 mana that does any non-land permanent. Normally for 2 mana, you're exiling a creature on an enchantment. But then, if you think to yourself, why not just use a Fateful Absence? And that's why I do, because this can also hit a Planeswalker as well, which is unlikely, because Planeswalkers, they're not actually that popular in Historic Brawl, despite giving the power. They're really strong as commanders, but within the deck themselves, don't see them that often, unless it's a specific deck that likes to proliferate a lot. So I hope that kind of explains to you the importance of removal, how much removal you need, and what types of removal complement your deck. They don't always have to kill. Some of them can be bounce spells, like this Saga, returning a creature. I would still count these as temporary removal, just given how short the games go these days. But normally you would say this is a tempo move, and tempo is just slang for speed, the speed of something. If you're bouncing something into an opponent's hand, you're essentially reversing the turn that they actually did that. And it's just as good as removal in a lot of cases. As long as you can follow up with other moves afterwards and take advantage of that tempo swing you just played, a bounce spell can be super effective. Then you have stuff like the Phasing of Zhalfir, which is interesting. It destroys all the creatures, but then replaces them with 2/2 black Phyrexian creature tokens. Now you might ask yourself, well, Josh, that doesn't sound very good. You might as well just use Day of Judgment. And that's true. But there's an interesting thing about Phasing of Zhalfir. You can phase a permanent out. It doesn't phase back in until you lose control of Phasing of Zhalfir. This is really useful because you can either deny your opponent access to a permanent, or you can deny them access to one of yours, which protects it in the meanwhile as well. So if you have an important thing you want to keep alive, let's say one with the multiverse, then you can keep this alive. You won't be able to use it, but you will keep it alive from opponent's kill spells. Let's say you just know what's in their hand. Let's say you used Invasion of Gobakhan, which looks at your opponent's hand, and you see they've got an enchantment removal spell next turn. But you use Phasing of Zhalfir to protect your bigger enchantment, so they'll be able to kill this, but that you'll protect your bigger one. So yes, it's a lot of different things to think about, but in terms of removal, start with 10 and see how you go from there. The rest of the deck can be your support cards, right? So we look at these cards. These is like the meat and bones of the synergy of the deck. So this is stuff like, how do I improve the abilities that my commander has? So normally what I do is I look at 1 or 2 abilities on the commander that I've chosen to use. In this case, I focus on the front side more than the back side, but that's another story. The front side cares about ETBs and returning things from the graveyard. So what did I do? I found a way to abuse the ability. What if we doubled the ability? I said to myself, what about Panamonican? This doubles the ability. And what else doubles the ability? Elish Norn. So this is why there's no set number, because a deck can have X number of synergy pieces that just definitely have to go in to increase the odds of you winning. And it's not always about 2-card combos. I'm not about that at all on my channel. You probably know that already. But I like synergy. Things that make other things work. It's like creating your own computer or machine or vehicle. It's just fun to see the wheels turn. The Panamonican with the Elish Norn. If you played a Solemn Simulacrum out with one Panamonican, you'll get 2 lands. And with the Elish Norn, you'll get even more lands. It's crazy. Other things you want to do with the deck. So now you've got the Panamonican and the Elish Norn. You think, well, we have an enters the battlefield tribal theme here. All of a sudden, the deck turns into an ETB theme deck. So you've got stuff like Reflector Mage, which can come in and it can bounce an opponent's creature to their hand. And doing this over and over again, you think to yourself, well, how else can I abuse ETBs? Well, what about Flicker? So then we look at cards like Thassa, Deep Dwelling, which flickers a creature every single turn for free. And then we just keep, it just goes in circles. It's self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you've got stuff like Soul Herder, which is a creature that cares about flickering, getting bigger when things are exiled. Obscure Polymorphist, which is one of our removal spells, which you can also flicker. Deputy of Detention, a removal spell that you can also flicker. So although these aren't enchantments, you can't return them with a Heliod, doesn't matter, because they still synergize with the core of the deck. The core of the deck should be one theme that unifies the structure together. Even though this is technically a strange value card, which technically gets something back from the graveyard, like a Reanimator style theme deck, you don't have to go all in. But I have even included cards that can go in with that way as well. Things like Consider. I was thinking about Self-Mill, but what's better than Self-Mill? Surveil, because Surveil is a controlled mill. You can or don't have to put the card into the bin if you don't want to Surveil. So you've got Curate as well, lets you Surveil too. You've also got Unexplained Disappearance, which is a bounce spell, which lets you Surveil. Faithful Mending is pretty good. Draw 2, discard 2, gain 2 life. And it's got flashback, so it stays in the graveyard. So you could even put this in the graveyard with another Surveil spell. And then Heliod can return an enchantment from your graveyard to your hand that you put in there yourself, rather than letting your opponent control what goes in the deck. So as you can see, deck building is pretty complex these days. There's just so many pieces, but I think that's the beauty of the game, isn't it? There are infinite combinations. There really are, I'd say, infinite combinations. So don't be disheartened when you see an opponent's Atraxa or Ragavan. I know it's painful, trust me, it is painful, but once you start to get used to building decks in a certain way that's efficient, you too can start defeating them with your own brews. And I hope watching my channel proves to you that you can just formulate your own brews over time and just, you get a feel for how things work in the game, in 2023 at least. So this was a pretty brief, to be honest, rundown of how I would build decks in 2023. So we've looked at the threats that you'll face, how to construct a mana base, pretty basic terms to be honest. What kind of removal should we put in the deck and how much removal? What kind of synergy do we put in the deck and how much of that as well? Just as the answer to that one mostly is as much as you can find. I guess one thing that I haven't really touched on yet is the mana rocks. So we can quickly just go through there. In Commander, I would normally use about 10 roughly, but in Historic Brawl, I feel like too much of a mana rock is firstly risky because these can be destroyed, but not always efficient because every turn you play a mana rock, your opponent could be playing a threat. In this case, I do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mana rocks as such, and a Loyal Warhound about 8. So we can say that's a pretty decent number, about 10%, right? Don't forget that when you start your game, you draw 7. Obviously, so you've got 92 cards left, so it's more than what I said before. But yeah, it's there's just so much flexibility. Just I guess aim for 10, but don't get too worried about it, because when you lose, you learn more about the game. The more you lose, the stronger you get. That's what I say. And even pros don't win more than 50 to 60%. So, we're talking about the top players in the game here. Yeah, I guess I've talked all your ears off now. But I'm happy to make more training videos like this if you'd like. Tell me what else you'd like me to talk about. Maybe another subject, maybe the same subject, a bit more in depth. But yeah, I hope I've given you a bit of a helping hand to maybe win more games, or at least have more fun, because consistency is fun after all. Cool, so good luck making your decks, and see you again next time. Did you know that you can help my channel by watching another one of my videos? Go ahead, you know you want to.